It was a mild afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind of day where the sun felt just warm enough to keep the cool breeze at bay. The city hummed with life, its endless rhythm of movement filling the air with distant horns, hurried footsteps, and the occasional murmur of conversation. On Melrose Avenue, outside a quiet cafe tucked between high-end boutiques and art galleries, a man sat at one of the outdoor tables. His presence, though unassuming, carried an aura that was impossible to ignore. He wore sunglasses that partially shielded his face, but even through the tinted lenses, there was no mistaking who he was. Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood legend. Despite the passing years that had softened the sharpness of his once rugged features, his presence remained undeniable. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen and done it all. The world knew him as the cowboy, the detective, the enforcer, the director. But here, at this moment, he was simply a man enjoying his coffee in solitude. Occasionally, a passerby would glance his way, their eyes lingering as if debating whether they should approach. But most chose to keep walking, respecting the rare moment of peace he had carved out for himself. Across the street, standing near the curb, another man existed in a completely different reality. Kevin, his clothes, layered and worn, told the story of days spent in the elements, of nights curled up in the cold, of struggles no one cared to ask about. His hair, tangled and unkempt, spoke of time without a home, without a place to belong. He clutched a small cardboard sign in one hand, its edges frayed from being held too many times. In his other hand, he fidgeted nervously, shoving it into his pocket, pulling it out, shoving it back in. A restless, anxious rhythm. Today marked 3 weeks since Kevin had begun sleeping behind the dumpster of a nearby convenience store. It was far from a home, but it was the best he could find. Somewhere to disappear when the world didn't want to see him. Kevin hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days. The hunger was no longer just a dull ache. It had become a gnawing, relentless force inside him. It made his limbs feel weak, his mind hazy, his very existence feel like a burden. His eyes scanned the cafe, searching for someone, anyone, who might look approachable, someone who wouldn't immediately avert their gaze or walk faster when he stepped closer. Then his eyes landed on Clint Eastwood. For a moment, Kevin hesitated. He knew who Clint was, of course. Everyone did. A man of power, of presence, a legend. What could a man like that possibly care about someone like him? But hunger has a way of eroding pride. Kevin took a deep breath, swallowing the lump of self-doubt in his throat. He knew the drill. Don't be too pushy. Don't make them uncomfortable. Keep your voice low. Step by step, he crossed the street. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he finally reached Clint's table, his voice came out barely above a whisper. "Sir, can you spare $1?" Clint didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked up, slowly. With deliberate movements, he reached up and removed his sunglasses, revealing a gaze that was both sharp and unreadable. For a moment, Kevin wondered if he'd made a mistake. Maybe Clint would shoo him away. Maybe he'd wave a dismissive hand and tell him to move along, like so many others had before. Kevin had seen all kinds of reactions: pity, annoyance, avoidance, even outright disgust. He had learned to brace himself for them all. But Clint didn't do any of that. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. His expression remained unreadable as he studied Kevin. Not in the way people usually did, not like he was a problem to be solved or a nuisance to be ignored. It felt different. Kevin's pulse quickened. The seconds stretched on, the silence pressing heavier with each passing moment. He could feel his palms sweating. He was just about to mumble an apology and turn away when Clint finally spoke. $1, huh? His voice was calm, neutral. Then, after a pause, he allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch his lips. Sit down. Let's talk. Kevin blinked. He wasn't sure if he had heard that right. Sit down? Had he really just been invited to sit at a table with Clint Eastwood? The invitation felt surreal, almost like a scene out of one of those old movies he used to watch when life was simpler, when home was a real place, and not just wherever he could find shelter for the night. For a split second, Kevin hesitated. Was this a joke? He studied Clint's face, searching for any sign of mockery. But there was no malice, no amusement, no condescension, just calm curiosity, a quiet understanding. Kevin swallowed hard. "Thank you," he murmured as he pulled out the chair. His hands trembled slightly as he placed his cardboard sign on the table, trying to angle it so it wouldn't draw too much attention. He was used to people staring when they saw it, some with pity, some with scorn, most with indifference. But Clint didn't even glance at it. He just watched Kevin. Kevin could feel the weight of that gaze, but it wasn't the kind that made him want to shrink away. It wasn't judgmental. It was something else. Curiosity, maybe, or something deeper. Kevin wasn't sure how long it had been since someone had really looked at him, not just at his situation, not just at his tattered clothes, but at him. Most people avoided eye contact, tossing loose change his way without a second thought, if they acknowledged him at all. But Clint was different. For the first time in a long time, Kevin felt like he wasn't invisible, and that in itself was enough to make his throat tighten. He let out a slow breath, trying to calm himself. Whatever this was, whatever was about to happen, he wasn't sure. But he knew one thing. He had just stepped into something bigger than he could have ever imagined. And it all started with just $1. Kevin could feel the weight of Clint's gaze, steady and unwavering. But it wasn't judgmental. It wasn't the kind of look he was used to, the ones that labeled him before he even spoke, the ones that dismissed him as just another lost cause. This was different. Clint's eyes held a kind of curiosity, like someone trying to piece together a puzzle, like someone who wanted to know the story behind the layers of dirt and despair. Kevin wasn't used to this. Most people avoided eye contact. If they acknowledged him at all, it was with hurried glances or an awkward shuffle of their feet before tossing him a few coins, just enough to ease their own guilt, never enough to make a difference. But this, sitting here under the steady gaze of a man he never imagined meeting, something inside Kevin cracked open. The words started spilling out before he could stop them. Words he hadn't spoken in years. I'm sorry if I bothered you," he stammered, his voice raw, shaky. I don't like asking. I've been trying to find work, but it's hard. Harder than I thought it'd be." He glanced down at his hands, ashamed of how desperate he sounded. Shame was a constant companion now. It followed him wherever he went, in the looks people gave him, in the way he shrank into himself when he walked past restaurant windows, in the ache of hunger that felt more humiliating than painful. Clint didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to fill the silence with empty words or false sympathy. He just listened. And that, Kevin realized, was more than most had done in years. The dam inside him broke. I was a contractor, you know, he said, forcing out a small, humorless chuckle. Had a crew, steady work. His hands tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. Then the recession hit, and the jobs dried up. One by one, the contracts disappeared. It didn't take long for the savings to run out. And then came the late notices. And after that, his voice faltered. He swallowed hard. Well, you can guess the rest. He tried to laugh again, but the sound that came out was bitter, hollow. Funny, right? I spent my whole life building other people's homes, and now I can't even keep a roof over my own head. Clint's face remained calm, but his eyes, they softened, just slightly. Kevin felt something tighten in his chest. He had told his story before, to job recruiters, to shelters, to anyone who might listen, but it never made a difference. It always ended the same way. A polite nod, a forced expression of sympathy, an apology that sounded more rehearsed than real. So he tried to steer the conversation away from himself, to shrink back before he said too much. I know you probably get asked for things all the time, he said quickly. I don't mean to be another guy with a handout. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I don't know what else to do anymore. There it was. The truth. Raw, unfiltered, exposed. Kevin braced himself for the usual response. The awkward shifting, the uncomfortable sigh, the distracted glance at a watch before a couple of crumpled bills were handed over just to make him go away. But Clint Eastwood wasn't the kind of man to brush off a story like that. He had a response Kevin never saw coming. The Hollywood legend leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped loosely. The space between them felt heavier, quieter, as if the world had slowed down just for this conversation. Kevin could feel his pulse quicken. He half expected Clint to sigh, hand him a couple of bucks, and say something like, "Take care of yourself, son." But Clint didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he asked a question Kevin wasn't prepared for. "What's your name?" Kevin blinked. For a moment, he just sat there, caught completely off guard by the simplicity of it. He wasn't sure when he had last heard someone ask his name, just for the sake of knowing it. Most people only saw him as a statistic, a problem to be solved or ignored. But Clint had asked as if it mattered. Kevin swallowed. Kevin. His voice was barely above a whisper, like he was afraid to claim it. Clint nodded slowly, letting the name settle in the air between them. Kevin, he repeated, like he was rolling the name around in his mind, feeling its weight. Then, after a pause, he said something Kevin would never forget. "You know, Kevin," Clint said, his voice steady, thoughtful, "I've played a lot of characters in my life. Cowboys, soldiers, detectives." A small, knowing smile ghosted across his lips. "And one thing I've learned is that every one of them had a story." Kevin held his breath. "Good, bad, ugly, it didn't matter," Clint continued. "What mattered was how they chose to carry it." Silence hung between them. Not the kind of silence that felt awkward or expectant. The kind that meant something. Kevin's hands clenched in his lap. For so long, he had believed his story was over, that the world had written him off, that he had become a forgotten character in a life that used to mean something. But here he was, sitting across from a man who had built a career on stories. And for the first time in years, Kevin wondered if maybe, just maybe, his own story wasn't finished yet. Clint's eyes met Kevin's. They weren't filled with pity, not with judgment either, just steady, knowing. "So tell me this, what's the next chapter of your story?" Kevin blinked. He wasn't sure he had heard that right. "The next chapter?" he echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. He had stopped thinking in chapters a long time ago. His life wasn't a story anymore. It was just a series of long, empty days, strung together by exhaustion and survival. Clint nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah," he said, matter of fact. "You're still here, aren't you? Breathing, talking, asking for $1? That means your story isn't over yet." "So, what's the next chapter?" Kevin felt a lump rise in his throat. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table. He didn't have an answer. He wanted to. He wanted to be able to look this man in the eye and say something, anything, that sounded hopeful. But the truth was, he hadn't thought that far ahead in a long time. Survival didn't leave much room for long-term planning. "I don't know," Kevin admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I just want to make it through the day." Clint exhaled softly, not in disappointment, not in frustration, just thoughtfully. "That's not a chapter, Kevin," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That's a sentence." Kevin's breath caught. Clint leaned forward slightly, his presence somehow even larger than before. "You need a chapter. A real one. Something you can build on." Kevin swallowed. A part of him wanted to push back, to say, "What do you know about struggle? About losing everything?" But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Clint spoke, like he wasn't just throwing out cliches, but actually wanted Kevin to think. Kevin looked down at his hands. His nails were lined with dirt. His knuckles were rough, skin cracked. What kind of chapter could these hands write? His whole life they had built things, homes, businesses, futures for other people. Could they still build something for himself? He didn't know, but for the first time in years he was actually thinking about it. The silence stretched between them. Then Clint reached into his pocket. Kevin's stomach clenched. This was it. The part where Clint pulled out a couple of crumpled bills, maybe gave him a nod of encouragement, and then walked away, like everyone else did. Kevin hated this part, the part where generosity felt like an ending, but Clint didn't pull out money. Instead, he slid a business card across the table. Kevin hesitated. "Go here," Clint said. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm, like a man giving directions, not charity. Kevin slowly picked up the card. The lettering was simple. A name, an address. It wasn't some fancy organization or government office. It was a shelter, a place Kevin had never heard of. "It's run by a buddy of mine," Clint continued. "They'll help you get cleaned up, find a job, maybe even a place to stay. But it's up to you to take the first step." Kevin stared at the card. His hands trembled slightly as he ran his thumb over the raised letters. He had asked for $1. That's it. He had expected to be given something small enough to forget. But this was different. This was a chance. Kevin swallowed hard, trying to push back the emotions rising in his chest. He had one question left. "Why?" His voice cracked slightly. "Why are you doing this?" Clint was quiet for a moment. Then his expression softened, just a fraction. "Because someone did it for me once," he said simply. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. And when Kevin looked into his eyes, he saw something there, something he never expected to see. Understanding. Not sympathy. Not charity. Understanding. Kevin gripped the card tightly. Maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet.